I think it's important to get the context of Westchester itself. We often forget that Westchester was such an early settlement with Rye in the early 1600s. And so our history goes way back, and it's often microcosmic, traces what happened across the country. And what was happening in Westchester often spurred the rest of the country. And that was true with many of the major movements. It could be said that leading abolitionists, we have to remember that New York had more slaves than any other state in the North. And so the abolition movement was incredibly important. And it was through the abolition movement that the suffrage movement grew. In fact, it was Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who were at an anti-slavery conference and weren't allowed in because they were women. And that propelled them to have the Seneca Falls Convention. It was because they were denied privilege to be even part of the abolition conference. So they started the Seneca Falls Convention on the basis that their Constitution, their Declaration of Independence would start, all men and women are created equal.
That's very much what the Quakers believed.
Many of the abolitionists were Quakers. Lucretia Mott, whom I just mentioned, and Susan B. Anthony were both raised as Quakers. And it was in the Quaker tradition that all individuals were created equal. Now, interestingly, many of the Quakers living in Westchester would be enslavers. They would also be among the first to free their enslaved servants or make them pay them instead of keeping them as having to work for nothing. And in fact, would even gift them land. An example is Stony Hill, which was the Purchase Meeting House's way to give property to the individuals they had formerly enslaved, but were giving them property once they were freed so that they could be property owners, landowners. In the mid-1800s, a woman was not only not allowed to vote, she could not own property, she could not get an education. If there was problems with the marriage, the man was able to divorce and would gain custody of the children. The woman would not. She had no legal recourse. Laws were being made that affected her, but she had no say in those laws. She was, in fact, a person of servitude, only on earth to take care of her husband and to raise his children. They had absolutely no rights whatsoever. If they owned property, they had to pay taxes on that property, but they had no right to the property itself.
So single women could own property, but married women could not? Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. And each state had different laws, and I don't know the specific laws, but at one point, women could own property, and then that was taken away from them if they were married. So this was just sort of the antithesis of progress in the 1800s. They were, in fact, having their rights taken away from them. So I believe that the Quaker women who became very involved with the abolition movement learned about organizing, and they learned how to give their opinions voice. They had the confidence. They had a few men backing them. At Seneca Falls, Frederick Douglass was in attendance. Lucretia Mott's husband was a very well-known abolitionist who also spoke. And they had the backing of some men, and with that backing, they leveraged more and more support from women and from men to go on to take on a variety of causes. One of them being women's Christian temperance movement was also one of the big movements of the day. So with these early beginnings in the mid-1800s with Seneca Falls and abolition hand in hand, they built up their skills to speak in front of others, to organize, to put out broadsides, to teach women how to read broadsides, so that the movement would move forward. In Westchester, for example, so many men did not go off to fight in the Civil War that things were just sort of kept status quo. It wasn't until World War I, and that was when the changes really took effect. Because with World War I, so many men went off to fight, and it was, World War I was considered a fight on the home front as well. And women were given all kinds of responsibilities, not only to keep factories and businesses going, but to raise vegetables and ways in which they could make and ship bandages, take up large collections of books to donate, all kinds of campaigns, the war bond movement. One of the biggest proponents of the war bond movement, who got so many people to buy into it, was Mary Pickford, the actress. And it was from her home in Larchmont that she started while she was working for D.W. Griffith. She was the highest paid actress in the country, and she, along with Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks, who would become her husband, were key in the war bond movement. But also on the home front, I mean, I think Westchester was like so many other communities in America, where the children were asked to participate in school by making bandages and having pageants and telling their parents they needed to kick in money for the Liberty Bond movement. And there were parades and there were all kinds of speeches. The Minutemen were going out, that's what they were called, to tell people to rile up the crowds. And it was community-based movement, grassroots movement for the good of the country, for the good of the world, for the good of democracy. And these women were often left to their own devices, and their devices turned out to be pretty damn good. They could mobilize in a nanosecond, and one really good example is in New Rochelle, where when they were about to cut off the draft in December of 1917, so men poured into the New Rochelle station to get over to Fort Slocum, which was the largest recruiting depot east of the Mississippi, and they came in from Maine and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, train after train after train. Well, the fort closed. They couldn't handle them. And the women in New Rochelle mobilized and cooked food and found housing and clothing. And by the end of the week, during a snowstorm blizzard, they had successfully cared for over 10,000 stranded recruits. And these same women, when there was the terrible influenza epidemic, were able to similarly mobilize to get people to immediately rally to gather up goods and clothing and make sure that their efforts were going to the right places. And this was not only New Rochelle, similar kinds of things were happening in every community in Westchester.
Scarsdale, I know, was very involved with the community gardens. They were very involved also. I mean, and that was also, I guess, their way of promoting the cause for suffrage.
A lot of men were sold thanks to the work that they did during World War I. They might have been skeptical or hadn't had the opportunity to see that women could actually do great things. And a lot of those victory gardens across the country turned into suffrage movement gardens and were a way to propel it forward. With Westchester, and speaking of Lower Westchester, Scarsdale, New Rochelle, Mount Vernon, even Yonkers, these were growing communities. And during this time, this was the key time for Westchester becoming one of the premier suburban areas in the country, one of the most fashionable places outside of Manhattan. So what the women were doing in Westchester reflected upon what women were going to do across the country. The women here had more resources. They were financially more equipped. Many of them had education, at least perhaps going to boarding school and some even to college, so that they had the education behind them. They knew how to read. They knew how to write. And with the better economic capabilities, with the resources that, yes, were probably the result of their husband's work or inheritance, with those resources, they had the time and the ability to put their efforts into a greater realm.
There certainly were a lot of sort of tea parties and frilly dresses as a way of, instead of the stereotype of the severe-looking woman that was saying all these terrible things about men, they kind of had a different approach in Westchester.
I think across the country, whatever was the social realm, whether it was a quilting bee or a fancy tea party or a church gathering, this is where women would come together, and this is how they could exchange ideas and how they could strategize how they were going to move forward. And fortunately, these tea parties often included guest speakers. And the guest speakers were the ones that would bring in the news from the rest of the country and put forth in the most eloquent way their opinions on how things should go to get women behind them. We have to remember that the women's club movement had just taken hold. Beginning in the late 1800s, as part of the progressive movement, the women's clubs were forming similar to how church auxiliaries and farm auxiliaries, but those were an arm of a men's organization. Women's clubs were formed by and for women exclusively. And this had started in the very late 1800s. And by the 19 teens in Westchester, they had really taken hold. And these women were getting together to make life better, originally taking up causes that related to domesticity, child protection, cleaning up slummed areas, making sure the newcomers, the immigrants, were taken care of. And then it was slowly catching on to bigger things. It took a while for the suffrage movement to take hold, but because they were meeting and having these teas, sometimes in frilly dresses, they had the ability to bring in speakers to make convincing speeches that, hey, are you really going to sit back and let men make all the decisions for you? And with their education and their social realm, this was not a tough sell for these women.
They couldn't really make change without the vote, right?
They had to have the vote. They had to have the vote. And that was crystal clear. And it was really clear after World War I. And they could see that they were no longer going to be able to sit back and let their lives be dictated by men without them having any say whatsoever. What I think it's important to note is that the black women living in Westchester had their own women's club. For example, and I'm going to have to use New Rochelle again, being a city historian and knowing that history, the white women's club formed in 1912. The colored women's club formed in 1913, the next year. And they formed as a group of domestics who formed to help the new domestics coming up from the South. They were going to help themselves, and they were going to lift up the new women coming up from the South by helping them get places to live, jobs, and education if needed. My guess is that they were also involved with the suffrage movement. I'm pretty confident. Unfortunately, we don't have documentation yet, but as you know, as we all know, with the digitization of records, every day we're finding new information, and I'm looking forward to finding more information about the Black women's clubs of Westchester, some of which are still going. Now, the white women's club, the Black women had to form their own clubs because the white women did not allow them in. And I would guess that most of the white women would not even allow their domestic servants to sit in the same social setting as they. I mean, we know the houses of the teens and the 20s in Westchester, even the middle-class homes had separate bathrooms in the basement for the domestic workers. This was something just totally unheard of. And though many of these women's clubs were all to benefit the needy, it was different than being an equal. That was something quite different. There is a program I've been giving for a number of years about the three leading American suffragists with close ties to New Rochelle, the first being Lucretia Mott, who formed the Seneca Convention with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her family lived in Mamaroneck, New Rochelle border. They had a large mill, and we believe they were instrumental in the Underground Railroad. She gave birth to her first child while she was here. The Mott family was very involved with the abolition movement, and of course she would go on with her husband to become involved with the suffrage movement. The second was Susan B. Anthony, who only was here for a short time when she was helping out a teacher who was sick. She took over the boarding school for a summer, but left diaries that were very interesting, mostly pertaining to her abolition opinions, but we know later that would turn into fuel for the suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony did not see the ratification of the amendment giving women right to vote, but the woman she had turned over the organization that led the movement was Carrie Chapman Catt. Miss Catt had grown up in the Midwest, but and had a varied career, mostly in education, but became very, very interested in the suffrage movement and very interested in being a leader. And she was the one who strategized the breakdown of the states and the importance of winning each of the states over to get the momentum to finally get President Wilson to sign for the ratification. And one by one, she was successful in doing that. She would, after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, she and her longtime partner, friend and partner, also a suffragist, would live in Newcastle in New Rochelle at Juniper Ledge. And she was still very involved with this temperance movement, and it was said she didn't want to stay living there because the juniper berries were used to make gin. But there are other reasons. It was a little too rural for them. So they moved, she bought a home in New Rochelle, just up the hill from where Thomas Paine's cottage was, which was significant to Carrie Chapman Catt because, of course, Thomas Paine had been one of the leading, early leading advocates for women's right to vote. And her grand home on Payne Avenue was situated just up the street from where the Payne cottage had been relocated. And here in this house, she continued to live until her death and continued to work on causes that were important to her. Women for Peace and Disarmament, the League of Women Voters, Women's Christian Temperance, the Women's Club of New Rochelle, a number of international causes for which she was widely recognized, voted as one of the most influential women. She was really a great speaker and a great motivator. She would have tea for 200 guests. We have a wonderful oral history by a woman also remembered marching for the suffrage movement and having tomatoes thrown at her. This was in New Rochelle. The local newspapers in Westchester do talk about the suffrage parades, and the newspapers that were clearly anti-suffrage movement are just sort of horrible, and their mentioning of the parades and how inappropriate it is for women, and they're almost laughing at them. This is what women would be up against in many communities. The men saying, "Oh, you silly women," and we're going to show you. And so, yeah, they would have tomatoes and other vegetables thrown at them. But these women were smart women. Before they would go out and march, they were trained. They were trained to look forward, to keep marching, not to respond. They knew on a national level, the training had been very carefully refined so that they would not be encountering and getting into more trouble that would, in fact, deter their cause, which had happened in Washington, D.C., when they had a big march and there was a horrible riot where women were hauled off to prison, but also many were injured, and they did not want that to happen. On August 26, 1920, when the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was finally passed, Carrie Chapman Catt celebrated by giving a speech. That's what she did so well. And I thought it would be good to share her words. This is what she had to say. "The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. Women have suffered agony of soul which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Understand what it means and what it can do for your country. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. No soldier in the great suffrage army has labored and suffered to get a place for you. Their motive has been the hope that women would aim higher than their own selfish ambitions, that they would serve the common good."